Fantastic. So, good morning. Thank you for joining us. You've got myself and John who will be chairing this. We've been referred to as the Saints and Greaves of process improvement. John, give us a wave. Don't be shy. So, thank you for joining us this morning. We're in for a treat, a very, very big treat. So, we're going to be talking digital strategy and why digital strategy is human strategy. So the relevance to that for everything that we see from a cube thinking perspective and from any other perspective is incredibly strong. Alex has led at Audi, he's led campaigns for Lexus, Toyota and umpteen other places, including the McCain Spuds as well, I think, haven't you, Alex?
That was, yeah, some time ago, but that was one of my projects.
So thank you so much, Alex, and we look forward to the presentation. Is everybody on? Brace for impact. Here we go. We're going to turn all mics off now.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate you inviting me on here. Good morning, everyone. Really appreciate your time. A little bit of background about me before I start. So my name is Alex Comyn. I have been working in digital for over 20 years now. I actually started in 1998 when I was originally working in the music industry. And I kind of saw the internet coming along and I kind of thought, I think the internet's probably going to change the world. And so I left the music industry, joined at the ground floor with actually quite a big digital agency. I was very fortunate and have really had a very, very sort of rewarding and exciting career since then. And I think sort of Jay asked me if I would sort of do a talk around digital strategy. And one of the things that kind of keeps coming up, and certainly a lot of people I've worked with recently, is we've stopped sort of talking about the idea of it being digital strategy and really going back to thinking about it as being ultimately human strategy. And I wanted to frame this talk really with something that a client of mine said to me a while ago when we were looking to kick off what actually became a huge transformation for their organization. We had just launched their new website, as you do. So we were in our sort of cycle of sort of updating their website, rolling it out across all 44 of their markets across Europe. And we had started doing our planning for what we thought we should do for the next version. And this was in automotive. And as we were starting to talk around, well, what should we do? What features should we have? What functionality should we have? We kind of took a hold of ourselves and said, hang on a minute, why are we talking about what the next version of the website is going to be like when actually we know that the way that people buy cars, they think about cars, they choose them, they shop for them, has fundamentally changed, and it's so much more than just what the website is about. And we kind of thought, you know, we need to sort of, this is a real opportunity to reimagine the entirety of the whole customer experience and to really think about that as being a differentiator and as a competitive advantage. And I'll come on to that sort of notion of sort of competitive advantage a little bit later. But my sort of client summed it up really well in that she said, you know, it's not, you know, the challenge isn't in putting a buy button on the website. It's in knowing what to do when somebody presses it. And actually everything to do with digital is to do with the people that ultimately make it happen. All digital is doing is just enabling, but without the ideas, without the empathy, without the thought, and more importantly, without the organization and the processes in place, you can't possibly hope to be able to sort of deliver something that people will want, that they'll fall in love with, that they'll keep coming back to again and again and again. And an agency, the agency I was working at the time was called Amaze. And what I really loved about Amaze, I was there for almost 8 years, was our whole kind of reason to be, which was to inspire original thinking through a deeper understanding of technology and human behavior. And it really is in almost sort of that order. Technology comes along, but it's people who ultimately embrace it and make it a part of their lives. And what organizations, what I'm seeing organizations do really successfully is focus on people first and foremost, because the one thing I've learned in the sort of all the time I've been doing this is that change is a constant, but people ultimately are the same. And that's what if you can focus on that, you can really actually start to make the most of all the opportunities and make change a part of your culture. So what I just want to sort of talk you through in the next sort of 10, 15 minutes is really around getting to the why. Why should you be thinking about a digital strategy? Where to look for the answers that will then help you come up with something that people will really want. And then how you can then start to learn through the process of rolling out that strategy. And at the heart of all of this, there's four things that kind of remain a constant that for me, you know, this is almost my toolbox whenever I'm asked to start thinking about what should we do for a particular campaign, or what should we do for a particular piece of work, whether it's sort of a new website, or whether it's a new app, or whether it's a whole new sort of business strategy. It's focusing on these four things. First and foremost, human behavior, where people are now, where they are in the future, where they've come from, and which one of those humans you're actually trying to connect with. The prevailing market conditions that really set the context around what success looks like. The technology trends that really drive how people are using technology, which ones are picking and which ones are falling by the wayside. And then most importantly, and this is the thing I think I really learned sort of very hard a few years, you know, certainly around sort of 10 years ago, was the business capability. An idea is only as good as the organization that can actually deliver it. And if you don't start with that, being really mindful as to what your business is capable of today and then what it's capable of tomorrow, your idea will only ever stay within the presentation. It will never get out into the real world. And I think that was the thing. Sort of going back to sort of some of the work I was doing at Amaze, we were working on this sort of big idea. You know, we started realizing that we had an opportunity to sort of reimagine the whole customer experience. And I remember going to my boss one day and saying, you know, we're not a digital agency anymore. We're doing change management, and we've never done this before. And it really shaped all this kind of future work we started doing from there on in. And I've only ever seen that, you know, if you can't do the change management piece right, you can't hope to get your idea off the ground. So looking at getting to why, I think that the key thing to remember is we're kind of fortunate in that we live in the world, certainly when it comes to products, is that everything is brilliant. That it's very hard now to buy a really bad car, or to buy a bad mobile phone, or to buy a bad piece of furniture or TV or anything. Quality is kind of inherent because, you know, the means of production processes have got so refined that you can guarantee that there's a certain degree of quality in everything that you do. But the problem is that kind of then throws a spotlight onto other things that a lot of businesses never really had to do before, which was how they deliver those products and services. And this is sort of a nice little sort of quote that myself and my colleagues have been living with for the last few years, which is that 89% of people stop doing business with a company after having a poor experience, and 53% vowed never to do business with them again. It's the delivery of those brilliant products and services that has become the big differentiator. And it's taken a very long time for a lot of organizations to really grasp that and fully appreciate that. And yet you get that right, you'll start seeing that, you know, really great experience is something that people are willing to pay for. And again, you know, 86% of people have said that they're willing to pay more for a simpler customer experience. There's a really great piece of research, it's done every year, it's called the Simple Index, and it highlighted sort of and quantified how much more across all different industries with different brands people were prepared to pay more for if they were offered a simpler experience. And the one that really stuck with me, because it was obviously very prevalent for the work I was doing, was in automotive. People were willing to pay 13% more for a better experience across the board. And that was something that really kind of got under my skin and really made me think we have to get the experience right, because we know the product's good. But the simplest thing, like not answering the phone on time, or having a poorly constructed form, or not responding to someone that's inquired about something on your website within a reasonable period of time, that could lose you a customer for life. And when you roll around how much that customer could be worth to you over time, it actually becomes an incredible sort of source of money that you're just leaving on the table. And whilst we were working with sort of sort of one of our clients at Amaze, we used to hold a big sort of digital conference for them every year. And we brought in an amazing guy called Jerry McGovern, who I really urge you to look up. He's the inventor of a thing called Top Tasks Customer Experience Method. And he was really quite militant in the idea that the job of brands is to remove the complexity of their organization from the lives of their customers. It's really easy sometimes to think about digital strategy being this huge thing that you have to undertake that can be very, very expensive and requires a lot of change. And the fact of the matter is, especially in sort of legacy organizations that have been going for often sort of decades, if not hundreds of years, there's a lot of things you just can't change overnight. So all you need to do is kind of remove them from the customer's view, deal with them behind the scenes, fix them in the long term. The bit you should be focusing on is that front end experience that customers see day in and day out. And the way that you can go about actually starting to think about how you can do that is obviously sort of, first and foremost, I would say start talking to yourself. Sit with people in your organization and start asking the questions as to why they do what they do. Why do they get out of bed every morning to come to work? What is it they think their role is with the customer? And this is something sort of I've been doing for over 10 years now, is talking to people in business and industry to help formulate a strategy that's going to work for their organization. And these sort of stakeholder interviews are really, really insightful. I mean, on the one hand, they are a really great way to get information. So that's fine. You know, you can ask people things like, what's the contribution of your department to overall sort of productivity? What's your profitability? What's your KPIs? But the bit that actually really, really interests me is the types of responses you can get from those stakeholders when you can ask a question in a certain way. And a really simple example, in some work I did with another automotive brand quite recently, one of the questions we asked them, they'd asked us to look at how we could kind of come up with a very, very premium customer experience. One of the questions we asked them, and we did it deliberately kind of off the cuff, we just said, hands up how many of you drive a company car? And they all kind of sort of put their hands up, and we said, okay, what car have you got? And they would tell us which different car they got. And then sort of the slam dunk was then saying, so when did you actually last go into a dealership and buy a car for yourself? And all of them looked at the floor and they all said, none of us. And that's the problem. That's how far away we are from the customer. So stakeholder interviews are a really good way to really start identifying what the unspoken problems are, not the overt problems. And that can really help you sort of find the solution. The other thing that's really, really important as well is actually trying to understand who do you think you are as a brand or as an organization. And this is where the role of sort of competitor reviews come into play. Now, you can do kind of sort of competitor benchmarking against your direct competitors. So Coca-Cola famously have been sort of competing against Pepsi since time began, and that has caused them many woes if you go back to the days of sort of New Coke. And that focus on your direct competitors can be helpful, but it's not always the way to go. And often what we do is start looking at not just competitors, but what we call comparators or peers. Who are the brands that you really admire, the organizations you really admire that are totally outside of your experience? And you could even, you know, I'm kind of being provocative, but even putting someone to compare yourself against to like Bowie, and you can say, well, what does that mean for my organization? You can say, okay, someone like David Bowie, they would reinvent themselves every few years. They were never afraid to collaborate. They're never afraid to take on new thinking. They really understood what different business models could help them through the music industry. And they always had a really keen eye on what it was that got people whistling their songs every day. And you really should be mindful about when you start thinking about benchmarking yourself, because everything lives in context. You've got to remember that customers don't just do business with you. They do business with around 20, 30, hundreds or thousands of different brands day in and day out. You have to be really mindful as to what makes those brands fantastic, and then what you need to do to meet that expectation that's already been set. And then through doing that, you can then actually then start to focus on what problem it is you're trying to solve. And often what will happen, and I've noticed this over the years, you will get a briefing from a client and they will say sort of typically, we need to grow our sales by this much. and almost for them the problem is we need to sell more stuff. And actually the job of a really good strategy is actually to help understand upfront what is a problem you think you're trying to solve, and then what is a problem you should be focusing on. And a really I'm trying to think of a really good example, but a really simple one for me was, the typical brief was, we need to get new customers into our brand because, we are losing market share to our competitors. And actually through doing investigation, you realize the one opportunity they weren't looking at was the customers they already had. And by shifting focus to these existing customers, there was a much bigger chance of, one, being able to hit the sales target that they were after. More importantly, reduce the cost of acquisition because these were customers they already had, so they were very cheap to sort of contact. And finally, actually increase profitability over a longer period of time. And that's a really, really big part of any kind of starting off a piece of strategies, really being clear with everyone what is a problem you're trying to solve, and then actually getting consensus on that, and then actually making that a central part of what it is you're trying to communicate. So the next thing then, sort of to touch upon, once you've sort of figured out the why, you understand where you stand in the great scheme of things, you understand who your competitors are, who you're trying to emulate, what problem it is you're trying to solve, and also being really, really mindful of who in the organization, sort of what the temperature of your organization is. You can then start kind of doing the do, as it were, sort of looking for where you can get the answers. And this is really where listening to your customers is really, really critical. There's lots of ways that you can sort of learn to listen to your customers. And I think sort of one of the great benefits of digital is it's really allowed you to access a much wider sort of group of customers than you ever could before at a much, much lower cost. If you look at different ways, whether it's through online surveys, pulse surveys, you can create communities online so you can study your customers over a long period. And going back to more traditional methods, you can just get them in a room and actually talk to them. And actually learning to listen is really, really critical, because you'll find more than anything is your customer knows your organization better than you. One, because they deal with it on a more regular, on a very frequent basis. But more importantly, they care about it more because they're willing to give you money or their time for it. So actually learning to listen to customers is something that I've always been surprised how little it actually occurs with businesses looking to kick off a major piece of strategy. And yet often it's one of the fastest ways to get to the answers that you need, and more importantly, strike up the sort of dialogue with customers. You really need to understand their journey. Something that we've been doing, I've been doing over sort of last 20 years, is actually mapping out what their customer journey is. So removing the whole element of digital from it, literally getting in a room with post-it notes and mapping out the start point. So when a customer discovers you for the first time that they sort of pay for you, the first time that they come back, the reasons why they stay, the reasons why they leave. And that in itself is something that is a very, very good mirror to then hold up to your organization to figure out and ask yourself, well, how easy or hard do we make it for them to do business with us? And that almost, that is such a fundamental thing that I've found a lot of businesses fail to do. They always think about, well, my department is responsible for this thing, and therefore, so long as I'm just doing that, that's all I need to do. And it's only when you actually start to opening it up to an organization and start joining the dots from department to department that you can really start to get people to think about, what responsibility do I have, whether it's back office or whether it's at the cash till or whether it's in sort of marketing. What responsibility do I have to the customer at any one particular moment in time? And what more can I do to help that customer do what they need to do now, tomorrow, and in the future? And then once you've got all that kind of state of the nation, you've got your as-is journey really mapped out, and you've identified what your strengths and weaknesses are, that's when you can really sort of get to task, and we sort of almost call it getting the crayons out. It's where you start getting busy with coming up with ideas on ways that you can solve it. And again, we deliberately remove digital from the equation because we focus on the ideas, we focus on the problem we're trying to solve, and we think about the different ways that we could meet that need. And what really helps, and what I've sort of learned to do, is to have almost like a whole toolbox that you can put different ideas through, because ideas can sort of often come from the least expected sort of places. A lot of people put stock in things like you know, brainstorming, and you know, there's nothing wrong with brainstorming, but they can be terribly inefficient ways to do business. They often rely on things like cognitive bias, because you're in a group with you know, a room full of people, and often it's the biggest opinion that will count. So you can introduce lots of interesting tools, different processes, different exercises to really start coming up with sometimes the most ridiculous ideas. And that's actually one of the tools we have, is come up with some crazy ideas that could solve this problem that are totally unfeasible. But within those ideas, there might be a grain of truth that could then be developed into something really, really tangible. And you want to come up with as many ideas as possible, so many that you can freely start to get rid of all the ones that are totally unfeasible. But you will end up with a load of real sort of gold, ultimately, that will sort of help you start to construct what a new journey could look like. So that's when you start sort of getting to how you start piecing together what your strategy should do for the customer. First and foremost, you really want to come up with what I sort of refer to as a simple vision, simply said. And obviously, with the crisis that we're going through at the moment, remote working has become a fact of life. And one of the runaway sort of success stories in all of this has been Slack, who you may or may not be aware of. But what is really interesting about Slack is that their proposition is just so simple. Slack is where work happens. It's a collaboration hub where the right people and the right information come together, helping everyone get work done. And if you can put that on a piece of paper and share it across your organization, everyone's really, really clear then on what their job is, what it is that they need to do, out of which you can then start constructing a whole suite of what we call experience principles to then bring that to life. So therefore you want a connected customer journey that can bring that whole idea to life. Go back to your original post-it notes, look at all the opportunities that you spotted within that process. Take all your ideas that you came up with and then start mapping them to a new customer journey. And think about customer journeys, not for different types of customers, but different states of mind. So the customer that's coming back to you for the 10th time, the customer that hates you and wants to go off to a competitor, the customer that's never heard of you and is actually looking for something that you can do for them. And what's really important when you do this exercise is you map that out in its entirety from start to finish, identifying every single touch point, both physical and digital. But then you want to underpin that with all the operational and technology requirements that can make that whole thing happen. So do we have the right technology stack in place, or do we need to move our hosting to cloud, for example? Do we have the right processes in place? Do we even have the right people in place, or do we need to start looking at where we hire from? And it's only by doing that and then actually then prioritizing all those ideas that you can then start to get a sense of what can we do right now that's going to make a massive difference, and what can we do in the future once we get the right things in place. And I think going back to the example I used at the very beginning, where I said my client had said, you know, it's not about putting a buy button on the website, it's about understanding what to do when someone presses it. Once we've done the strategy for them, we then focused on one very, very small problem that we knew caused a lot of friction for customers. And that was the fact that we always asked them to repeat themselves when they moved from their website into the physical store. And we came up with a way of eliminating that completely. And it's then, you know, really putting all that thinking to bear on one small problem that, you know, for the customer could make a really significant difference. And just getting that one thing right can then give you a really great case study to take around the rest of the business, and then start sharing that, and then start thinking about what you do next. Alongside with that, you really need to focus on the right KPIs. A repeated comment I've had over the years from clients is, we know how to collect data, believe me, we've got so much data. The problem is we don't know what to do with it. And again, if you can focus on the right problem that you want to solve, that makes it really simple to then focus on the right KPIs that you should be monitoring to know whether you're getting close to solving that problem. KPIs is not a report, it's not a dashboard. For me, KPIs and data is another way to tell a story about how successful or how poorly you're doing for the customer. And, you know, if you want two really great case studies on KPIs, if anyone asks me, how do I understand more about data? I would say, one, look at the success the Sky cycling team had, where they really honed in on incremental gains, how many more seconds they could shave off their personal best every day in their race, and how they could influence that through things like diet and additional training. And the other one, if you've got a couple of hours free, watch a film called Moneyball, which is about how one statistician turned around the fortunes of a very small baseball team and made them national leaders in baseball in the US. And it's a really good insight on understanding how data can help you sort of solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And then finally, you know, have a focus on the right team. Really understand who is it we have in our team that can make everything possible. You know, this is where the whole notion of digital maturity comes in. And again, back in 2010, when it sort of dawned on us that we weren't a digital agency anymore, we were actually moving into the business of change management. Understanding then the shape of the organization, the capabilities of the organization, and having the tools in place to audit, track, and then improve that organization became fundamental in moving things forward. And it's a means to then sort of get that slow turning ship, as my old client used to refer to themselves as, into this sort of lean, mean, fast moving operation that could do anything within a few months. And that takes time. Place, once you give them the right measures around themselves, they can then suddenly explode, and it can be amazing. And then finally, you know, you keep the customer at the heart of everything you do. And this is really just a really, really simple framework of sort of how I keep the customer at the heart of everything I do with my clients. You have your broad-based research where you're looking at emerging trends, you're agreeing on what future priorities are down the line that you need to look at, and you're really defining what future customer and business proposition should be. And that can all be done through desktop research. You have that continuous consultation, which is things like prototyping, which is things like sort of online Q&A with customers, get them involved in the development of new processes, get them involved in testing and iteration. And then finally, use your data. So as you put stuff live, as you roll it out, look at what the data is telling you and look at how you can continuously optimize. And so really, sort of just to sum up, from insight to action, it's that whole process of going from, first and foremost, articulating what the customer challenge is, developing the right insights and hypotheses to take forward. It's then about coming up with the opportunity statement that captures an actionable way to create real value around that challenge. It's then coming up with an expression of how that value can be realized, so coming up with a really great, simple proposition. It's then rapidly creating concepts validated by your audiences that can then bring that thing to life. And then it's about having a playbook driven by data, driven by customer insight, driven around understanding of your organization to then be able to roll out that program, utilize it, and continuously refine, improve, and replace what isn't working. And that's me done.
Wow. Thank you, Alex. Thank you very, very much indeed. Incredible insights there. And I think it's totally apparent that for a competitive advantage, it needs to be representing digital in the human world and humans in the digital world. And I think we've seen a divergence in many areas where actually what you said is we need a convergence of bringing it back together. So thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to just ask if anybody's got any questions. We've had one from Richard Harding just to kick us off, and he said, have you any top tips on cultural disruption, please? So straight in with an easy question there, I don't think.
Well, yeah, I think for me, cultural disruption, it's actually asking those really hard-hitting questions. I keep going back to when we asked a room full of sort of marketing people from automotive if they drove a company car, and then actually asking them, so when did you actually last buy a car for yourself? Cultural disruption can often come from realization, really understanding that mindset. I think with one client, it was landing that point that it isn't about, what am I trying to say? It's not about what they do for a job. It's about what they do for the customer and their contribution to the customer. And it's about opening their eyes to really thinking about peers outside of their immediate competitor set, and giving them almost the sort of the permission to want to be as good as the brands that they use themselves, that they really admire, or the people they really admire. That in itself can really open the doors, and that's where you get real change. Is saying, you might work in automotive, and actually, you know, I'll say this. A lot of the brands that we looked at when we were doing work with the likes of, say, Toyota, for example, was we took them to retailers. So we gave them a tour of Burberry, who had their flagship store in London, and we looked at what they were doing with their digital strategy. And that really helped them to understand what great customer service looks like, how you can talk about a product without having to keep referring to price, and how you can sell people on the benefits of the inherent quality. I said at the beginning, most products now are pretty brilliant. It's the way that you deliver it that is really, really critical. The time you take to sort of spend with your customer and take care of your customer. And that is, you know, that alone, opening people up, including back office. I think at Burberry, they said their security staff were all trained in customer service, because they had people that were stopping off in the middle of the night on an overnight flight from, say, Saudi Arabia on their way to New York. They stop off at Heathrow to pick up all these lovely Burberry Macs that they bought online, and those security staff were some of the best customer service people that they had. So it's really being mindful of that.
Fantastic. Any more questions? I think it's definitely apparent that if you ignore the user experience and the customer experience at your peril, and there definitely seems to be the businesses or the organisations that get it, and the ones who are still in, as you said, that pre-2010 world, where at best they see digital as having a website rather than the, I know the phrase omni-channel is probably getting a bit tired now, but they've got all the options which are out there, including voice, and looking at them, well, what's the next option? We see some links as well with something that John's quite heavily involved with, which is Industry 4.0, which is the usage of the Internet of Things in the design of the next part of the Industrial Revolution. And certainly when it comes to factory layouts in those areas, John, you've seen quite a lot of opportunities, certainly for businesses, to at least keep digital on their radar and their North Star for heading in, particularly manufacturing, haven't you?
Yeah, it's amazing really on digital. If you thought about where companies were looking at even 5 years ago, mentioned digital, it'd be, you know, maybe we're using the cloud, but it's more, you know, we're using Windows and Microsoft, or we're using an iPad. So whereas now it's just exponentially grown, and even when we start talking to manufacturers about what the opportunities are, it's phenomenal. You know, the Internet of Things, as Alex just mentioned, you know, you've got robotics, you know, there's big discussions now about, only prior to the meeting, myself, Alex and Jason were talking about the opportunities within manufacturing, about bringing those products back from China because of the benefits that can be realized from new technologies. So the opportunities are massive, really. One of the things I was thinking about, Alex, was you talked about doing, we call it value stream mapping, so mapping end-to-end process for that customer journey. Who, in your opinion, do you think you should include in those meetings?
You want sort of, obviously you want representatives from each of your departments each of your departments. You want them to be bringing their relevant data with you. A lot of the big sort of thing that we've been doing, especially in the last project I've just come off, is actually sort of collating all that data and overlaying that. Yeah, I mean, it's representation from everyone in the kind of chain, as it were, and often that includes people outside of your organization as well. So obviously working in automotive, you are by its nature dealing with a multi-party purchase, where you've got the manufacturer, so the brand, you've got then the retailer, which is a different company, and then often the finance company, which is another company as well, and bringing them all together. It all goes back to, first and foremost, you know, being really militant about saying, okay, it's what does the customer see? And often, you know, it's they will see just the name above the door, regardless of whether then there's other companies involved. So you really want to sort of assemble everyone that will come into, whether it's visible or behind the scenes, will come into the customer's life.
Yeah, I did an exercise once with a hospital. So it was the same process, and we talked about not having the customer experience, but we talked about the patient journey. You know, and someone said, you know, you're going to do this process, and it must be easier in manufacturing. I said, well, no, because when we do this process, value stream mapping, we'll actually bring a few patients in.
Yeah.
We'll be able to talk to them about their experiences on how they found it going to the GP, going to the consultant, you know, the experience of going into the hospital and trying to find somewhere to park, and, you know, queuing up and waiting for hours, and being, you know, numerous attendees going to see the specialist. But it's amazing, isn't it? Because that experience, and when we talk to the hospitals, the number of improvements that were suggested, thinking about what our current state is on how it's managed today to the future state, how we could be in the future, then it was amazing. And I think at the time we were talking about choose and book. So that must be 10 years ago, and now that's standard. And this was a massive digital revolution. You know, choose and book who you want to see, and more or less book it online. You know, at the time it was a bit far-fetched, but it is reality now.
I mean, I do think bringing the customer into it is so much easier now. One, because the prevalence of data is so much easier to access. It's a really, really good view, a really good way to get sort of the honest views of customers, actually just to see how they behave across all your different touch points, and where you lose them. Yeah, I mean, I think what the thing that I always find really shocking is when you do that initial customer map and you map everything out and you show it back to the business. That's often the first time a lot of organizations actually understand the whole chain of command and actually start to realize that thing that I do here actually has ramifications down the line there, or I do all this work up here, but we lose customers down there and I don't understand why. And that is why I kind of said I didn't want to talk about digital strategy. I wanted to talk about human strategy, because it is about how people within the organization talk to each other. And it's always the way. The number of times you meet with customers where they say, we're siloed organization, and that's our biggest problem. And the minute you can start to break down those silos, everything suddenly starts opening up. You want to talk about culture change. It's that one of my clients used to call it cross-team collaboration. Actually making that work is hard, but once you get it done, it's just like the floodgates open. It's amazing.
Okay, want to say an enormous thanks to Alex. Alex, that was top-notch rock and roll presentation there.
Thank you.
Mexican wave even.
So yeah, thank you so much for your time.
So this is being recorded, so we will put it on the Cube YouTube channel in a couple of days, so we can share it from there. But thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Keep playing to win. Keep smiling. Be good.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
See you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Be good.